Welcome to another episode of The Watchdog with me, Lowkey. This week we have a special live stream and an investigation of the way in which pro-Israel organizations are able to insinuate themselves through the curriculum in both the UK and the US. The UK side of things I will cover a little bit later on. But to start with, we have Jessica Buxbaum, who has worked as an investigative journalist, some great stories, Middle East Eye, Middle East Monitor, The New Arab, and also Mint Press. And the one that we want to talk about today is specifically her study of an organization whose name seems to obscure more than it reveals. Today, we are going to talk about an organization which goes by the name of the Institute for Curriculum Services, the ICS. Now, as we will just get up in a second, some of its information on the internet, its website, its Facebook account, and its Twitter account, you see that at first glance, this organization certainly would not appear to be a pro-Israeli organization or to have any type of interest beyond quite benign functions for the US schooling system. But as Jessica has revealed, there is quite a lot more to this organization than meets the eye. And I have myself researched some of the employees of this organization and found some quite interesting overlaps, which I think are worthy of scrutiny. So firstly, Jessica, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
No problem. And just to start with, if you could just break down for us, what exactly is ICS, the Institute for Curriculum Services?
Yeah, definitely. So the Institute for Curriculum Services actually operates as a 501c3 under the San Francisco JCRC, so the San Francisco Jewish Community Relations Council. It's also a grantee of the Schusterman Family Foundation, which supports these AIPAC charity, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, the main Israeli lobbying organization that sends it supports the American Education Foundation, I believe, or American Israel Education Foundation, that then sends Congress members to on sponsored trips to the occupied lands of Palestine. So ICS basically just sort of says that they're this, they're trying to correct racism, anti-Semitism, trying to give a more accurate picture of Jewish history and Middle East history in U.S. textbooks, which at first glance would sound something like, like a good thing. I mean, I think all of us can pretty much say that American textbooks, history textbooks, have very glaring inaccuracies, especially when it comes to minorities, civil rights, etc. So ICS, kind of on the backbone of that, says, okay, well, we're going to, correct some of the Jewish history in public school textbooks. But really, they're just a front for the Israeli lobby, as I kind of found out, and as other activists have in Virginia uncovered, that what they're doing is they're hosting all of these teacher trainings, and they've gone to like 90 US cities, had more than probably 6,000 teachers participating in these seminars where they talk about the conflict, or as they say, the Israeli occupation of Palestine, but the Middle Eastern conflict, the Arab-Israeli conflict is what they call it, in these seminars. And they're just presenting things in a very Israel lobby, Zionist lobby framework. And then what I ended up finding out is that they're also heavily involved in textbook review and textbook review processes across the country. So Virginia activists had first found this out, that this was happening, where they were sending their proposed edits to the Virginia Department of Education and to textbook publishers there, saying, okay, change certain lines in the textbooks that relate to Palestine, that relate to Israel. And they're also doing this across many other states in the country as well, trying to get, and sometimes they are successful in getting textbook publishers and state departments to take on these proposed edits.
And also, I mean, they claim to have reached around 11 million students in the US, which is actually quite a sizable proportion of the US student base. I mean, you also have an organization like Stand With Us, who has possibly a wider reach and wider presence within US schools, as far as I understand. But you just mentioned the editing of textbooks, and I think that's a key theme of today's show, because we also have a very serious example of that has happened in the UK over the last few years. Now, some of the things which are listed in your article, and it would be great if we can pull that up now. In your article, you talk about the ICS changes to public school textbooks. For instance, replacing the word settlers with communities, or the word wall with security fence, or the word occupied territories with captured areas. The important thing about this is these actually represent legal distinctions. So it's interesting the way in which they're trying to play with these meanings. Also, according to your piece, ICS have requested that all references to Palestinian territories in some cases be deleted. There is attempts to change the legal status of East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights on maps, taking them out of that designation as occupied territories, and changing around some of that. If you were able to just break down for us what some of these requests have been for edits in textbooks, and how successful those attempts have been.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so in terms of what they've been successful in doing, mostly from what I found was in California, which is, where they're based. They're based in San Francisco, and they've gotten textbook edits accepted there. And basically what they're, a lot of it is about erasing Palestine, erasing that there's, anything that references the natives of Palestine, Palestinians as an indigenous people, that Palestinians have inhabited the land for thousands of years. All of those things they want to have deleted. If you even mention Palestine, they want to have added mandate, or British mandate of Palestine, or something that doesn't just say Palestine in and of itself. They talk a lot about when they talk about the settlements. They would say things like, "Don't say that Jews settled in the land. Just say that Jews joined the other Jews that are already there." So kind of almost erasing this whole idea of settler colonialism that's going on. God, and what I found so shocking was that in Kentucky, there was this one. They go through and they look at all of the different textbooks and that the Kentucky public schools are using for their social studies and history curriculums, and they spend so much time reviewing all the textbooks and then picking it apart. And so they said in some of these Kentucky textbooks how, first off, they said, take away how the idea that that the water aquifers in the occupied West Bank are being disproportionately used, and that settler colonists in the West Bank receive more water than the Palestinians living in the West Bank. And they said, that they wanted deleted. They wanted that edited out. They also mentioned how, take away the sentence about how Palestinian citizens of Israel don't have, as many rights and are discriminated against. And they said, no, take that out, replace it with that Israeli Arabs, and they would say Israeli Arabs, have full legal rights just as, their Jewish counterparts. And those things both of those things are just factually untrue. This is not about even a matter of, opinion, or whatever. This is literally, these are facts. And this is stuff that, just as being a journalist working in Palestine, it's like, I know that, water, the discrimination of water rights, and the disproportionate use of that in the West Bank. That's a straight up fact. And they don't want that to be talked about. They don't want to be talked about all the discriminatory laws that Palestinian citizens of Israel, Palestinians who live in the 1948 occupied Palestine experience. They just want to say, oh, well, they have their full legal rights. That is not true. And there are countless laws that show this. So it's about just wanting them to warp this history and to make it come away as that American students and American teachers who, to be honest, probably don't have much of a good background on what's going on here in Palestine, to come away with basically having a Zionist perspective and thinking, they wanted to put things in saying Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, erasing the idea that how can a place be a democratic state when it's practicing apartheid. So things like that, which I found incredibly shocking and which, bothers me a lot to my very core of having been an American student. And, I didn't really learn too much about Palestine and Israel when I was in elementary school, but this is what they want kids to be taught. I don't know if that answers your question.
No. Also, it would be great if at this point we could bring up their Twitter account and their Facebook accounts, because I've studied quite a few different organizations which function as Israel lobby groups. They have differing degrees of coordination with Israeli embassies or Israeli consulates. But the interesting thing I find about the Institute for Curriculum Services is it's quite well obscured what its aims are, really, when you look at its presence. Obviously, it does have that in the top right-hand corner, the topics. So that might give some indication of its orientation, but generally it seems quite well obscured, and also it seems to enjoy, from what I can tell, quite a respected status. It's not really treated as a partisan intervention into the education process. And something that I looked at actually in terms of employees of the Institute for Curriculum Services was I found that Bella Ben Shach, who is the deputy director of this organization, was actually previously an employee of the Ministry of Tourism of the Israeli regime, of the Israeli state. Now, this is quite a significant crossover, really. In addition to that, I also found a former employee of Institute for Curriculum Services, Rick Brody, who was an analyst and reviewer at ICS. And he previously was employed at Birthright, the Israeli operation to persuade essentially Jewish children around the world to become Israelis. Now, have you had a look at any of those other aspects? You stated at the beginning, part of the background of this, officially this charity is tax exempt. Do we have any information about employees or funders of this organization?
I mean, I don't know too much about the employees, I have to say. So it is interesting that, you were able to kind of look at that and look at their LinkedIns and see, where they've been. In terms of ICS, I mean, they are tied to the Jewish Community Relations Council in San Francisco. And they're also, part of the Schusterman Family Foundation, which has an AIPAC tie. They also, they were in, I think, they're in a webinar by the Jewish, the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, so the JCPA. So this webinar that was back a couple of years ago in 2018 was with the ICS director, and it was a JCPA webinar, and it talked about the ICS's success. So they are backed also, they are backed by these several Israeli lobby Jewish, national Jewish organizations, the JCPA, JCRC. And when they're sending these letters, when ICS is sending these letters to the state departments across the country, the letters aren't being sent by ICS exactly. They're being sent by either the local or state or district JCRC, Jewish Community Relations Councils, or the Jewish Federation or JCPA. I mean, they're being sent on, they're saying, okay, this letter is being sent by these, usually it's a joint effort. Like I think in California, for instance, when they sent it to the State Department there, it was a joint effort by like the Jewish Federation of Los Angeles and the Jewish Federation of the Desert, all of these different Jewish Federation and Jewish Relation Council groups, all who are heavily involved in the Israeli lobby, sent these letters on behalf of ICS to the State Department saying, okay, saying basically like, dear State Department, we had ICS review, these textbooks, and we think you should adopt these proposed edits into your, curriculum, into your textbooks, etc. So that's what, that's usually what I noticed, is that, they're very much intertwined, even though ICS doesn't necessarily broadcast this on their website, for instance.
I mean, you also have other organizations like Camera, like Stand With Us, that both essentially attempt to groom young people into ambassadors for Israel. Camera focusing its campus branch focusing on proselytizing to young children to students in universities about the importance of getting involved with supporting Israel stand with us on a slightly larger level in terms of in schools having quite a lot of swing. But what we've had here is actually quite an interesting sort of parallel process play out in Britain, whereby you have organizations which are far more straightforwardly actually Israel lobby groups attempt to edit a textbook that was used for GCSE students. That's the age of 14, 15 in British schools. Now, the groups that did this were the Board of Deputies, which said in its 2020 trustees report that it has a close working relationship with the Israeli embassy. Also, of course, UK Lawyers for Israel had somebody on that team that was working to edit these textbooks. And what was found was that actually you had an average of 3 changes requested per page. Now, in the first version of the textbook, the phrase, quote unquote, Jewish terrorism was mentioned 10 times. Palestinian terrorism was mentioned 32 times. But now, following the intervention of these pro-Israel lobby groups, you actually had only 4 references to quote unquote Jewish terrorism and 61 references to Palestinian terrorism. So they basically doubled the amount of times that Palestinians could be referred to as terrorists. Now, you had really a pushback from some academics in this country. A group of them got together and said that these books are now essentially in danger of being seen as propaganda, and that the publisher should reassess these textbooks and ensure that balance is returned to them. The team that took part in the editing of these books was the Board of Deputies International Relations Officer, who identifies herself as Israeli, Talia Ingelebi, who we have mentioned before on the show. But then you also had Susan Storing, Richard Millett, Jonathan Turner, and Caroline Turner of the UK Lawyers for Israel. And I think it's important that people have an awareness about what is the UK Lawyers for Israel. Well, it's believed that initially the announcement of this organization was made on the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs website in May 2011. However, the page was later deleted. You later on have had the UK Lawyers for Israel hosting talks with the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs. You also have the cooperation and coordination of UK Lawyers for Israel with Shohadin, which is an Israeli law firm that was revealed by WikiLeaks in a leaked US embassy cable to, quote unquote, according to the US embassy cable, take direction from Israeli intelligence and Israel's National Security Council on which cases to take. So, these are quite plainly Israel lobby groups that have tried to do this in Britain. And I think there's another interesting organization that has a presence in British schools by the name of Solutions, Not Sides. And I think it's quite important that people have a greater awareness of this organization and what it does in the UK context, because you have the founder of, it's kind of a project of, forgive me, it's a very, very hot day here. It's a project of an organization by the name One Voice. Now, One Voice was founded by Daniel Levetsky, a billionaire from the US. But Daniel Levetsky, simultaneous to that, is one of the directors of the ADL. Now, of course, the ADL back in the 60s, just a year after it had started officially working with the FBI, was identified in an FBI internal memo as it being incredible to assume that the ADL was not furnished to a representative of the Israeli state. and the FBI in this memo were questioning whether the ADL were actually in violation of the Foreign Agents Registration Act. So simultaneous to Daniel Lubetsky founding One Voice, he's also a director at the ADL and also is on the board of the Israel Policy Forum. But the key thing that Daniel Lubetsky has said about the functions of One Voice is he says explicitly that it's an anti-BDS organization, that it exists to build trade ties between Israel and neighboring Arab states. But then out of One Voice comes this project, Solutions, Not Sides, which supposedly is focused on instilling neutrality into the quote-unquote debate about Palestine within British schools. Now, I've looked in depth into this organization, and I have found that not only does it share funders with the Friends of the IDF, with illegal settler colonies in the West Bank, even the Conservative Party in Britain, I've also found that it had at least 3 employees simultaneously working for the Israeli government at the same time as working for this organization, and at least 28 former Israeli military or intelligence personnel among its workforce. Now, how would it be acceptable for an organization with such clear bias within it, even if from the macro level it wasn't biased, for this many employees within it to have these connections with one of the states or one of the parties in terms of this conflict? How would it be acceptable for them to be teaching about Palestine in British schools? Essentially, it is a behavioral change program which is aimed at young people, and particularly the Muslim community in this country. You know, if you were to look at just the board of One Voice, which again is the parent organization of Solutions, Not Sides, literally its US board had Elizabeth Turner on it, who was an AIPAC lobbyist, who formerly was an assistant to the director of Israel's foreign ministry. You also had Jeremy Solomon on there, who's a key advisor to Daniel Lubetsky, but also was involved in the Bronfman philanthropies groups, which were essential to the founding of Birthright program. You also had Yoni Komorov, who's second lieutenant in the Israeli military. You also had, war criminal Danny Rothschild, who was the deputy director of Israeli military intelligence, but he was also the commander of Israeli military units in occupied South Lebanon, and actually a military ruler of the occupied West Bank. And Danny Rothschild had to abscond from the UK in 2011 for fear of arrest for war crimes, following a warning he received from the Israeli embassy. You also had Ephraim Snare on the board of this organization. Now, this was Deputy Defense Minister of Israel, and he was responsible in that role for an assassination campaign, which, the Guardian newspaper described as a policy of murder. Another figure formerly on the board of this organization was Gideon Grinstein, who was the founder of the Roy Institute, a key Zionist think tank, which described London as the hub of hubs of delegitimization for the Zionist project. Another person on the board was Harriet Green, who was a director of BAE Systems. Now, of course, BAE Systems makes the HUD technology for target selection in Israel's F-16 fighter jets. It's really, the board has historically been a who's who of pro-Israel voices. You had Jonathan Sachs, who's a member of the House of Lords and sat on the council of the Tony Blair Foundation. You had members of the Israeli Knesset there, former deputy foreign minister of Israel, former Israeli minister of minorities. Now, when we look at this question of the people that have been employed by One Voice, in the past, you have Yaniv Rivlin, who worked for the Israeli embassy in the UK at the same time as working for this organization, supposedly teaching children not to be biased on the issue of Palestine in British schools. And he worked not only at the Israeli embassy. Before that, he'd been a first sergeant in the elite combat intelligence unit of the Israeli military. Also, another person that simultaneously worked for this organization and worked for the Israeli government was Ro Newman, who was the head of communications for this organization at the same time as being head of communications for, at that time, the Israeli Minister of Justice, Tzipi Livni. Now, let's not forget that this very person, Livni, was summoned by the UK police in 2016 to be investigated for war crimes in Gaza during the massacre of what they call Operation Cast Lead in 2008 and 2009. So literally at the same time as being the head of communications for this organization, Ro Newman was the head of communications for a war criminal. Now, it also has an Israeli branch, this organization, One Voice, called Darkano. And this is a direct quote from its own trustees report. It says, Darkanu recognizes that security is at the forefront of Israelis' minds and organizes a series of peace and security seminars with security experts, including former heads of the IDF, Shin Bet, police, diplomats, and former prime ministers. Of course, Shin Bet is Israel's internal intelligence organization. But that's not all. We also have taken a look at some of the funders of this organization and seen where that leads. So, for example, you have money coming from the Ted Erison Foundation, which not only funds this organization teaching in British schools, it also funds the Jerusalem Foundation, which builds in settlements in the West Bank and Jerusalem. You also have the Righteous Persons Foundation, which actually is founded by Steven Spielberg. But not only does it fund Solutions Not Sides and One Voice, it also funds the ADL and the Jerusalem Foundation. You also have the Kerev Foundation, which funds the Anti-Defamation League at the same time as funding the Friends of the IDF and the JNF, which also builds settlements in the West Bank. So simultaneous to supposedly funding an organization that is there to educate children, you have these organizations heavily invested in the building of settlements. Another one, of course, being the Crown Family Foundation. You know, we know the Crown family have been essential to the Aspen Institute, the development of the Aspen Institute. But the Crown Family Foundation itself has also funded the Friends of the IDF, the Jerusalem Foundation, and the JNF, of course, the Crown family gaining their wealth from General Dynamics historically. So there's many things about this organization which should cause young people to be seriously concerned. What I think has been, you know, fairly objectively speaking, quite impressive about Solutions Not Sides is the way it's been able to procure funding on top of these other donors from the British state. So what you have is this sort of state capture whereby specific councils, and strangely councils that have a higher proportion of Muslim population, so what they often refer to as prevent priority areas, about 70%, 70 to 80% of the Muslim population in this country live within prevent priority areas, which means that prevent funding in those areas is more considerable. And we know that prevent is the British government spy program, basically, which focuses on ideologically investigating children in schools. You know, under the prevent program, you can have 3-year-olds questioned by counter-terror police without the knowledge of those children's parents. And so the interesting thing about this whole Solutions Not Sides thing is it's actually integrated quite heavily into the counter-extremism push. And it's also, part of the wider interfaith push in this country. And there's several key interfaith organizations who have disturbing links to the Israeli government, whether it is Nisat Nashim, which is a project of the Board of Deputies. According to the Board of Deputies, it was incubated. Nisat Nashim was incubated by the Board of Deputies, which are widely spread across schools and mosques in this country. So I think the interesting thing about this is that you have very similar tactics being used in both the US and the UK in terms of targeting populations to sort of astroturf a pro-Israeli viewpoint. I'm also interested, Jessica, you have published quite a few years ago now a story about pro-Palestinian students being banned from attending a visit of the Queen to King's College University in London. Now, that was quite the scoop, because King's College University has a real reputation as being a real incubator of people that go on later to work for mainly British and US intelligence services. But it's quite interesting that there's this sort of anti-Palestinian slant to what happened at King's College. Could you tell us just a bit about that story, please?
Yeah. I mean, that was from a while ago. That was back when I went to City University of London grad school, journalism school. And towards the end of my time there, I was just doing a couple freelance stuff. And I wrote that piece for the Middle East Monitor. And from what I remember, it's been a bit of time, but I think basically, there's a whole group of pro-Palestinian activists. It might have been a Students for Justice in Palestine chapter. I don't quite remember. But when they go into, when you enter into King's College London, and to go into the buildings, you have to use a card to get in. And when the Queen was visiting the college for whatever reason, these, like the president or one of the main voices of this movement on campus, who is Palestinian, she wasn't able to, get into the university, into the university buildings. The card wasn't working. I mean, these were things that happened. They just somehow couldn't go into their classes and into school, and they were denied access. And they ended up, posting about it and publishing about it. And that's how I found out about the story. They talked about it on social media. But also they did a whole protest, basically on campus against, what happened to them. And I think it's, to me, it just shows the level of the university administration wanting to basically suppress and silence this kind of activism on campuses. I mean, we see this obviously in the US, where they talk about against the BDS, the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement, activism on campus, and just talking about Palestinian rights on campus. You see this very much from the university administration level, and also outside government institutions as well, coming in and trying to change the narrative on college campuses so that this kind of stuff isn't talked about. But then seeing it on a British campus, it's very much a parallel of the governments and authorities trying to suppress dissent and just to speak out on an occupation that is very much funded, obviously, by the US. And I
think it's also interesting because what it articulates is the way in which pro-Palestinianism is seen as a litmus test by established power structures in the world. So if you think about if we could algorithmatize how likely a person is to, be opposed to imperial wars, how likely a person is to be rebellious, they would often use a sort of conveyor belt type of analysis that would say, well, if a person is supportive of Palestinian humanity, then they are somehow more likely to be Republicans and against the monarchy. They are somehow more likely to kick up a fuss when the Queen visits. Another organization here that seems to have quite wide access to different organizations is Forward Thinking, which is populated by people from the Institute for Statecraft, like Oliver McTurnan and Chris Donnelly. These are British military intelligence and MI6 figures that seem to have this organization Forward Thinking, which basically outsources what the Israeli government wants in terms of normalization, in terms of astroturfing an acceptance of Israel among different Arab and Muslim groups. It's a group that's seen to sort of engage the unreachables. And Oliver McTurnan actually said in a speech that he made at Harvard in 2006 that the organization was set up with the coordination of Amos Giora. Now, Amos Giora is the highest legal opinion within the Israeli military. He is the person that constructs the arguments that justify the bombing of hospitals, of civilian locations, let's just say, in Gaza. And this is the person that was involved right at the seed stage of Forward Thinking, which is an organization that has very wide access to all types of different parts of Muslim civil society in this country, regularly goes back to the state of Israel and to the Knesset, to, in Forward Thinking's own words on its website, get feedback on its activities. It's celebrated at the Menachem Begin Center, which is, of course, set up by the Israeli government and funded by the Israeli government, celebrated Egypt's peace accords with Israel. We know that historically, the Institute for Statecraft also featured Daniel Lafayette. Daniel Lafayette described himself at a Herzliya conference as a delegate of BICOM. BICOM is the largest Israel lobby group in this country. There's many different ways in which what Forward Thinking does, and that's one of those ones where it's actually in the name. The name doesn't obscure what it does. It works to, as I say, astroturf within the Muslim community a pro-Israeli viewpoint, or at least a normalization viewpoint, which can later mean that these, particularly the reading of the Arab Spring among some sections of the British establishment, is that Muslim Brotherhood or Muslim Brotherhood adjacent groups are most likely to inherit the rule of countries in the Middle East. They are a political power player. If you look at Algeria, you look at Egypt, you look at other places, the Muslim Brotherhood have been suppressed, but they do have wide support among the populations. So it's for that reason that an organization like Forward Thinking would target their groups here that are linked to them to try and get them to come around to the idea of normalizing with Israel. And I think what I find quite amazing, actually, as someone that has studied a lot of these different groups, is how many different angles they attempt to cover in advocating for Israeli interests and for engaging with different groups of people. I haven't seen an equivalent to an organization like Solutions Not Sides in the United States. Perhaps you have some aspects of stuff that Combatants for Peace does, or other organizations. But these organizations which target the Muslim community and the Arabic-speaking community in this country are very well funded, very well organized. But the problem is there is not enough criticality within our society to really understand what is being done to these people and what the aim of this engagement is. And as I said, the worrying thing about it is it's often wrapped up in the counter extremism and de-radicalization infrastructure. Jessica, you've published some really great stories on Mint Press, and I've always enjoyed reading your work. Is there anything that you've been working on recently that you are particularly excited by or feeling passionate about that you could enlighten us on?
Does it have to be for Mint Press or can it be for?
No, absolutely not.
I mean, I'm sure that this has been covered, and I'm sure you're fairly aware. But I mean, I was working on a piece today about Masafriata and the historic ethnic cleansing that is going on there. And for folks who don't know, Masafriata is this rural enclave of villages in the occupied West Bank, south of Hebron. And it basically was part of the area. 12 villages were declared as a firing zone, an Israeli military training zone, and meaning that, people can't live there in the 1980s. And it went through decades long battles, and until most recently last month, actually around the time of the known as the Independence Day for Israel, but basically the Nakba Day, the day of ethnic cleansing, and when then Zionist state was formed. So as they're celebrating this national holiday, the Supreme Court decides to issue its final ruling and say that they agree with the Israeli army that this will be a military training zone. The people there are not permanent residents because they're shepherds, so they're not permanent residents. And so now, and it's already happening now, these communities located in the firing zone are receiving demolition orders or having demolitions enacted. Last month, almost 50 people were displaced. The army carried out demolitions. The people in those villages then put up tents. This month, at the beginning of the month, they knocked down all the tents. And it's not just that it's happening in the firing zone. It's also just the demolition orders being received by, for instance, in Tawani, which is actually the only village in Masafriata that is on that has a master plan. So it's hooked up to, the electrical grid, which is crucial for Palestinians who face these demolition orders. The whole problem is that they get these demolition orders on the grounds that they don't have building permits. Well, you can't have building permits without a master plan, without zoning and infrastructure. So that's having zoning is very important. Of course, it's all very difficult to do that when you're Palestinian. So Tawani is the only village there with a master plan, meaning it should not be getting demolition orders. But the Youth of Samud, which is a Palestinian grassroots activist organization, their community center just received a demolition order on the grounds that it's located outside of the master plan, that it's on an archaeological site, things that the activists with Youth of Samud say is not true. They're within the master plan. They're not on an archaeological site. So they shouldn't be getting these demolition orders. I mean, the people in Masafriata have struggled for years with army violence. They're surrounded by illegal Jewish colonies, so just filled with radical, violent Jewish extremists who commit crimes and assault and attack Palestinians. And now the entire region of Masafriata has basically just become as one activist and resident there told me, it's like an army base now. There's just military just in jeeps patrolling the area. They're setting up flying checkpoints, so they're setting up temporary checkpoints at the entrances of the villages that are facing eviction and displacement. It's even more increased, the army and the settler violence. I mean, they had a protest last week, huge Palestinian-led protest. More than 200 people were there. And there was lots of violence, against, even Israeli activists who were standing in solidarity. They were detained by the army, and then when they were driving back in their car, they were stopped, and the settler colonists came and just threw stones at the car, and some of the activists got hurt. I was at a protest for Masafriata recently, and I saw a settler colonist just punch a Palestinian demonstrator in the face and broke his nose. So this is, that to me is something that I've been working on, among other things, that I think is really important for people to bring a lot of international attention to, because at this point, their only way that they're going to, I guess, stop this displacement is by having enough international pressure on the Israeli government to stop it in some way.
Sorry, and just before we play that video of the attack of the settlers that you mentioned, it's important for people to realize that Masafriata is part of Area C. It says that it's a civil administration, but what that means is it's directly the Israeli military. So 98% of the requests by Palestinians to build in this area are refused. It really epitomizes the use of infrastructure as a weapon and architectural violence against Palestinians. And, this attempt to impose firing zone 918 on the area of Masafriata is a bitter battle. Of course, the Israeli government have claimed that they want that firing zone there because the terrain is similar to the terrain in Lebanon, and the idea of Israel fighting in Lebanon, what I would say is they need to remember what happened to them in the south, because they certainly do not want a repeat of the humiliating withdrawal that Israel had from the south. And we hope that the brothers and sisters in Masafriata are able to punch those settlers back square in the face and break their jaws. Now, Manar is going to play for us that video of the settlers' attack on the activists' car, just for that to play us out today. But thank you so much, Jessica. It's been a really enjoyable conversation, and I hope that we can have it again soon.
Thank you again.
Continue to do your great work.
Oh my god, אתה בסדר? כן. זה היה הוא? פאק. Oh my god.
Get the video on.
Oh my god. סעמק. זה הרי שלא תתרסי אף אחד. את בסדר? נו. כן. כוסים השניים. טוב.
Okay, thank you for that. So that was a great episode where we covered some very interesting ground. We hope that those watching this can support Mint Press in what we do. We are going against the grain week after week, covering stories which are routinely ignored in the mainstream media. So we do hope that you can support us on Patreon and that you can share and click like and comment on this video. Thank you very much. This has been another episode of The Watchdog, and we hope that you will join us again next week. Thank you.